What is up, everyone? Today we're talking about if I were to start a podcast again in 2025, what I would be thinking through. So just some context here before we get into the video. This is not a how to start a podcast in 2025. This is not a how to edit your podcast or how to record a podcast or what platform to post it on. This is more of a high level discussion on the different types of formats of podcasts, how I'd be thinking through growth, stuff like that. So the alternate title to this video that I'm making right now is why I stopped making an interview podcast. That's how I'm pivoting my podcast, which is called Branding Deep Dive, in 2025. So this is the agenda. These are the points I want to cover. This is just here so you can decide whether or not this video is for you. If it's not for you, not offended at all, you can click off. But if it is for you, I'm going to be talking about my story, my podcast, why I started a podcast, who should and shouldn't start a podcast, the different types of podcasts there are, at least in my experience. This is kind of what I listen to, so there may be more that I'm not familiar with, but this is just my limited, what I consume and what I'm kind of seeing. And then, you starting a podcast as a hobby versus business, what are the considerations to think through there? And then how Branding Deep Dive, this podcast that I run, is going to pivot in 2025. So let's get into it. So a little bit of context here. My podcast is called Branding Deep Dive. I started it in 2020, I believe. Might have been 2021. Can't remember now. But it's been a few years nonetheless. And I started it with a buddy of mine with the intention of learning more about branding and marketing. My kind of passion before, when I was in college and even in high school, I really enjoyed psychology, marketing, understanding what makes people buy, what makes people click. And then just kind of happened where my career ended up going in a different path, and my full-time job, I wasn't really working in marketing. And so I created this platform for me to continue to learn and kind of create some form of like accountability for myself where I could kind of keep learning. Books, aren't the way that I learn best. I'd like to actually do something. So for me, this was just like a way I could kind of consolidate my learnings and then put it out there. And then, every time we create a new episode, we learn. So it started off as like me and him would do deep dives on specific companies or brands. And we'd kind of go through notes of like, hey, this is what they did well. This is what they could do better. This is what they didn't do so well. This is the lesson here. And this is what small businesses or people looking to build their personal brand can actually learn from that. So for example, the first episode we did was on the Ford Bronco. So we had a whole Notion doc with notes on, their Bronco release strategy. They release a podcast. What can we learn from that? If you're a small business, how can you take some lessons from that and that kind of thing? And then so over the course of these last few years, I've done a total of 65 episodes. I've done 2784 downloads. It's not much, but hey, it's not nothing either. So it's, a good number of people that tuned in to listen. I'm appreciative of all the listens and downloads on YouTube. We actually had a little bit of a different strategy. We started off just posting the raw video without any effort into it. But then slowly we tried doing clips. We tried doing some video essays. I just have some random other videos of other things that I tried. So total had 164 videos. If you look on my channel now, a lot of them I have privated and hidden, so you won't be able to see a lot of them. A lot of the podcast episodes I've made unlisted. I still have it in a playlist if you want to see all the episodes, but they're still there. Most of my views come from just one video on Apple that I kind of released right when they released, made the announcement for their VR headset. And, I talked about their marketing strategy versus Meta's marketing strategy, and it just hit the algorithm. So most of my YouTube views have come from that, not the podcast, actually. So that's some context on me. And then here's just some disclaimer I would say. If you're thinking about starting a podcast and you haven't started yet, this is why you shouldn't start a podcast. So number one, you want to interview famous people. You want to be famous. You want, to make money. You want to, for example, you want to pump and dump a meme coin. This may be too soon. If you get the reference, let me know in the comments. If you don't get the reference, I'll explain it in the comments. But basically, if you're trying to get rich quick, this is not the way to do it. So why you should start a podcast is if you're deeply interested in a topic, and the surface level videos you see on YouTube or the blog posts you read, It's just not doing it for you. You want to get a deeper understanding. You want to synthesize a bunch of different viewpoints and create your own narrative and understanding of a certain topic. That is the perfect person for a podcast. I always like to say, like, you don't get bored talking about a certain topic, even when other people, like, you talk to them for a little bit, they're like, all right, let's talk about something else, but you still want to talk about a certain topic. That topic is what you should start the podcast on. Or like you have like a unique angle, lens to share on a certain topic. You may have a certain experience that gives you a different perspective than what the majority is kind of saying out there about a certain topic. And I think that is also a unique angle to bring to a podcast. So why did I start the Branding Deep Dive podcast? I already covered this a little bit, but just to kind of reiterate, I started this because I wanted to learn more about marketing and branding. Me and my friend Abdul Manan, when we started, we were people that, like, when a company did a rebrand, we'd actually analyze it and we'd talk about it all day. And like we would get bored, or like we wouldn't get bored talking about it when all of our other friends would be like, can you guys talk about something else right now? And so that's kind of why we started this. And really it was just to learn more about marketing, branding, and then have a way to continue to learn, even though we don't have any formal clients or any work that we were doing at the time. So my last episode I've actually posted was actually in November of 2023. So it's been over a year since the last episode I posted. So when I started off with that format where we would do a deep dive of a brand or a company. And then as it evolved, I started doing interviews and started talking to different people, started talking to people in branding, started talking to marketing people, started talking to founders, got a lot of really great insights, really great lessons. But November 28th, last episode, kind of stopped doing interviews after that. And so what happened for me is really just a changing of interest and saturation in the way I was doing things. So I found that what I really wanted to do was go back to a similar format and the similar type of podcast that we were doing at the beginning, where we were doing a deep dive of just one specific thing, rather than just talking to a bunch of different people at a surface level. So what I was doing is I was talking to these different people and just having like a 1-hour conversation. And it was kind of a surface level conversation, and a lot of the lessons and a lot of the points that I was learning started to get a little bit repetitive. And so for me, I just felt like, okay, like if I really want to learn more about branding marketing, I need to stop with this format, stop interviewing people, and I need to go deeper in on the subject or whatever it is I want to talk about myself. And so what that looks like is videos like this. I've actually been consuming a lot of videos where it seems like it's just like a person on a Loom video. So I said, hey, why not just try out this format? And I think one of the things you'll notice, even like when I'm watching certain content, I may be following someone for like 6 months. I keep seeing their videos. I'm like hooked on their videos. And then at a certain point, I'm just like, okay, like I think I understand this guy's message. And then you kind of, you're like, you see his video and you're like, okay, like I don't really need that message anymore. Right. And so this is kind of a natural progression with our own content consumption. So why can't it also be with content creation, right? So like the purpose of me was to learn more, and now I feel like I've learned what I needed to learn from that interview style. Now I want to take it to the next level, and how do we do that is to actually, by going deep, taking notes, actually putting some reflection and thought into a certain topic, and then putting it out into the world. Not to say that the people that I was interviewing, they definitely had that depth of knowledge, but for me, for me to grow, I feel like I had to make that leap myself. So now you must be thinking, I'm listening to your whole story. I see what you're saying, but what does that mean for me? What type of podcast should I start? I know I want to start a podcast. I'm interested about a certain topic, whether that be, a certain sport, maybe, for like branding, marketing, like for me, for example, maybe a certain topic. How do I decide what type of podcast I should start? So I broke it down into these kind of high level categories of podcasts. So the first I would say is like the generic interview podcast, which is within there's like 2 formats. So there's the long, unscripted, deep conversation without research. So this is like the Joe Rogan, Chris Do on the Future podcast also does this. Like he doesn't really research, he just kind of wings it. And part of the draw for these, part of the draw, actually the biggest draw for most of these, you'll be surprised, is actually the host, the interviewer. So like the reason why people want to listen to Joe Rogan podcast, yes, like the guest plays a factor, but Joe Rogan's ability to have a discussion with them for 3 hours is a big factor as well, right? Like to keep the guest engaged and then also as a result the audience engaged for that time is a pretty impressive skill. Now the other format of this is the actual super well researched alternative. So like Joe Rogan is completely unscripted. He may not even know the topic they're talking about. They just kind of jump around topics. Whereas the other side of this is like the Jordan Harbinger, the Chris Williamson, like they do in-depth research and they go deep on certain topics with the guests. And so the next format is like talk show podcast is what I call it. So this is similar like on TV where you have talk shows, like for example, ESPN's First Take, you had Stephen A. Smith, you had Max Kellerman and some of the other co-hosts there. Those were recurring co-hosts and they would talk about topics every day, and you came for their chemistry. You came because you wanted to see the debate back and forth between those recurring co-hosts. Sometimes they'd have guests on as well, but for the most part you're coming to that show for that specific dynamic, the chemistry between the co-hosts. And so for in podcasting right now, I think the best example for me and what I listen to is the My First Million podcast. Sam and Sean have an incredible dynamic together. They just feed off each other very well. They both come prepared, and they're both just funny. It's just fun to hang out with them. And then next category I would say is like the solo podcast, where you just have like an in-depth deep dive of a certain topic. This is the Huberman, spending 2 hours on water and the water quality, stuff like that. That's what that looks like. Now you'll notice there's a lot of overlap in these. It's not like, so Huberman also does interviews, right? And those interviews are like pretty in depth. But like what I mean is when I talk about these, like My First Million is known for like that chemistry between them, and like yeah, they still interview guests and stuff, and they have interviews, but really like you're coming back to the show for that chemistry they have together. Huberman, you're coming back for his depth of knowledge, his in-depth research, and the guests, yeah, it's just like an added bonus. And I think a lot of these guys, that you do it just to grow their audience and expose their their own show to the guest audience. So and then the last but certainly not least is the highly produced journalism podcast. This is like a serial. This is those NPR podcasts. These are the ones that are actually like hard work to compete with. Like these are well researched story style. You have like, it's like a whole movie, except without visuals, right? It's just audio. So for the sake and purpose of this video, I'm assuming you're going to be in one of these three categories. Either you're going to do an interview podcast where you're going to interview people, or you're going to do a talk show type podcast where you have a co-host and you guys talk about a certain topic consistently. So like for My First Million, they talk about business ideas consistently and business stories. So those are the two recurring themes they talk about when it's just them two. Now in there, they also have some episodes where they interview people. But what I mean is like, that's the theme of their podcast. And so the third one, of course, a solo podcast, the in-depth, and this is what I'm kind of trying to transition my podcast towards. And then there's I'm assuming you're not going to be in this highly produced journalism podcast category. If you are, you probably don't need to be watching this video. You probably already got things figured out. Moving on, what I want to talk about is podcasting as a hobby versus a business. Now, the approach you take when making a podcast, when it's a hobby versus a business, is going to be very different. So here's what I mean by this. Most people do not make a single dime off their podcast. In fact, most people actually lose money on their podcasts. Like for example, if they're hosting a website, there's a monthly fee to host a website. And so you're not making, and that's not much, like it could be like $10 a month or whatever, but you're not making that money back in most cases, right? You may make it back in other ways. Like you may make a connection that ends up, leading to some business for you guys, something like that, but you're not making it directly back in like advertising revenue. Most people don't make that money back. Now, if you are doing it as a hobby, you can basically just talk about whatever you want, and there's no kind of considerations. Like, growth isn't your goal if it's a hobby, and growth is hard for podcasts. Like, this is one thing that I think people underestimate, because you see so many podcasts out there that you think that growth is easy for podcasts. Now, the reason you see so many podcasts out there, but if you actually like look, like it's like the same maybe 10 to 20 podcast clips that you keep seeing, is because those guys have figured out how to actually grow, and they're playing the game at like the master level, whereas everyone else that's trying with their, like most people know someone with a podcast, but it's not picking up steam. Like, it's not making money. Why is that? Because podcast growth is hard, and you got to treat it like a business if you actually want to grow it. And it's not as simple as just posting the video on YouTube. Like, maybe there was a time when there weren't as many podcasts on YouTube where you could just post the video on YouTube and it'll just pick up. But now you actually have to put in work into growing your podcast if you want to grow the podcast. So now let's talk about what things look like if you're doing this as a hobby. You can talk about what you want to, when you want to. You can talk to who you want to. There's no rules, restrictions. It'll stay fun. Like, and you can basically just stop if it's not fun. Like, there's no, you haven't promised an advertiser you're going to send out an ad. You're going to do an ad read, so you don't have to like stick to a certain schedule. And like, you don't have to necessarily, like, once you've reached your goal, like with Branding Deep Dive, like once I felt like I wasn't growing anymore with that format, it just kind of stopped, right? Like, and no one was like, hey, like, why'd you stop, right? And so that's the benefits of doing it as a hobby. Now, that being said, if you do it as a hobby, very low likelihood that you're going to end up making money from it. You have to actually take this seriously if you're going to turn it into a business. So if we're going to turn it into a business, there's a few different business models that I've seen that are successful. There may be more. These are just what I've been exposed to and what I've seen work for the people that I know, that I've talked to, and that I've seen. So, and like, I've actually had guests on the show that have walked us through some of these different models, or that I know are using some of these models. So, I can kind of get into, I can share some of those details with you guys if you're interested, but really there's like three main ways. Number one, I'm going to go with like the easiest one to make money, and is like to use it as like a B2B networking tool. And how that works is basically, let's say you have an agency that does short form content for a certain industry. You can create a podcast for said industry. So let's just say it's real estate. You can create a podcast for real estate, and then you can reach out to people that are influential in real estate. And then you can do a good job on the podcast, create a bunch of clips, and then like you can go ahead and make the pitch, be like, hey, like, I do this, like, is your company interested? And you already made the connection. You already kind of had good chemistry with them. You can tell if on the podcast you have a good discussion with them. And you can basically try to pitch them like that. And that would be basically a tool for networking with potential clients, like prospects, right? Now, the second way is to use the podcast as a nurture tool for a product, membership, etc., whatever it may be. So what that looks like is, let's say you have a product, you have a service, you have something you're selling. You basically use the podcast so that people can get more familiar with you, your brand. And then in the podcast, you then make the call to action to sign up. You're basically providing more value to the user and to convince them to actually sign up. The last model, the most famous one, but also the hardest one, is advertising. And so this is where you see Joe Rogan does like 3-4 ad reads at the beginning. Huberman has a bunch, Athletic Greens, right? Like, there's a bunch of brands that are kind of well known because of these ad reads. These are basically, you have an audience that's big enough where brands will come to you and say, hey, do an ad read for us, and we'll give you X amount of dollars every time you do an ad read. Now, for this one, you actually have to grow your podcast to a level where it makes sense for brands to spend money on. So that's the hard part about this one. Now with advertising, this is the least amount of like fulfillment work, right? Like you don't have a product or service on the back end. Your product is the podcast, but because your product is the podcast, you have to market your product, your podcast, like an actual product. So you actually have to get the users, you have to get the downloads, and you have to have the numbers to back, advertising budgets for this. Let's get into the growth aspect of each of these. So like if you're actually using your podcast for B2B network, it's the easiest relatively. All you got to do is cold email the people, and really like cold email is pretty effective with podcast if you're industry specific, right? Like if you're going after famous people, like you need connections. It's not like maybe a few years ago you could probably get some famous people on just by emailing them, but now the landscape has gotten a lot more competitive. You can't just get like, some celebrity to come on your podcast for free with just a cold email, right? Like you can get industry specific celebrities. So like you can get someone in real estate, probably you can get someone in marketing, right? Like I had on my podcast, I had one of the guys, he's the like director at one of these branding firms. So like you can get people like that are kind of known in their industry, but may not necessarily be like a celebrity that's all over the media and everything. So cold email generally works pretty good with them, and then after that it's just really nurturing that relationship, doing a good job with the podcast, showing you're prepared, making a good impression, and then just working your sales magic, just pitching them, and not being too pushy, but seeing if they need any help with anything. The next thing for a membership product, etc., you're gonna have to have another top of funnel traffic source. So that could be YouTube, that could be Facebook, that could be TikTok, whatever social media platform. But what you'll have to do is invest in that to get people to your podcast, right? And so you'll have to really find a way to get traffic to your podcast, and then from there on your podcast you actually make the pitch or the call to action to the product or service or whatever. And then for advertising, there's a couple things that work generally pretty good. From what I've heard, I haven't done all these, but from what I've heard from successful podcasters, ads on other podcasts generally do pretty well. So if you're running an ad, let's say you have a business podcast, you run an ad on another business podcast, generally that works pretty well. If you speak about trending topics, and you kind of do packaging right for social media, so like for example, if you're, let's say a certain topic like the politics, election 2024 was trending. If you make a bunch of podcast episodes on the election, and then you do the right title, the right thumbnail, and really package it properly for YouTube, there's a good chance you can get a bunch of new users from YouTube just by playing that game right. So there's a couple different ways you can do that. And of course, there's other traditional advertising methods as well, but really these are the things that work well for podcasters. Like Joe Rogan, one of the main growth engines was YouTube and those clips he has. A lot of times he'll be talking about trending topics, and just because he has so many of those in those discussions over the course of 3 hours, he may talk about random trending topics with those people, and then he'll just put them as a clip on YouTube. And a lot of people ended up just watching those little clips, maybe not even seeing the full video of the 3-hour discussion, but those clips really helped gain more viewers, more listeners for Joe Rogan. And that strategy works pretty well for a lot of these, Diary of a CEO. A lot of these guys use a lot of short form content. And so coming back to Branding Deep Dive, what is the next step for Branding Deep Dive? I think I mentioned this earlier, but really what I want to do more of is this type of longer form deep dive. I really want to take the deep dive part seriously in Branding Deep Dive. Just did a video recently on the Walmart rebrand, and that is the type of format I want to do more of. Maybe it's not a full hour, maybe it's not even 20 minutes, maybe it's just 5-10 minutes of just me kind of going through a presentation, walking you through, hey, this is what I'm seeing, this is kind of what I learned. And that's kind of how I see this evolving. If you like this format, let me know if there's any way I can improve. Would appreciate that. And then if you're starting a podcast, let me know below what the topic of the podcast is, and if you want to share your link, Share it. Share it. I don't know if YouTube's gonna, mark you as spam if you share your link. So maybe just mention the name of your podcast and the topic, and then we'll check them out. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you next time.